Here we are again with our reading lecture for week 8, and we're still working on, I'm hoping you're reading the story Barn Burning, by Haruki Murakami, who's a Japanese writer. We're obviously reading it in English. And then also there's a Korean film that I think I mentioned from 2018. Some people kind of like to watch a movie along with a book or a short story because they feel like they get a little bit more comprehension or understanding. But be aware if you do watch that movie, if it's on Netflix probably or Amazon or somewhere, if you do watch it, it is a slightly different version and they've changed it, somewhat. So not only being set in a different country and a different time period, but different in a lot of ways. So anyway, but that is our reading for this week. And the other thing is we have an article on addiction, and so we'll be talking about that too. And before we even get into that, the story we were reading last time, Temporary Matter, lots of people have read and already commented on that. If you haven't, though, I think I mentioned this in the overview lecture, feel free to still do that. You can still just go in. It's an easy way to pick up 50 points, but also a great way just to show that you're staying up with the reading and that you kind of have a sense of, and also I think by reading other people's comments, you really get an idea of maybe a little bit more depth into the reading and a better understanding, which will help you write your essay when you get to that. So again, this is from the movie, not the book, and these some of these images that I have here. But the thing to think about is the important characters as you go through the reading. And in this story, there are really only 3 characters that you hear much about. I have to go back and think. There's just very few, if any, mention of other characters. But you have a young woman, and then a man who's involved with her, but seems to have his own family also. And then their involvement, it's kind of unclear exactly. You kind of have to try to read between the lines, a little bit like back to some of our other stories, like the Hemingway story, the Hills Like White Elephants, where we weren't really sure what was going on always between the man and the woman. It's kind of understated, and Murakami definitely does that as well. And then you have a third person, and then in the movie, it's this guy who is a new boyfriend who she meets while she's traveling, and there's a lot of things going on that we don't know under the surface, and so we have to try to sort of figure that out as you read. You'll have to try to figure that out. But that's character and conflict. The story's set in Japan, the story we're reading, and I believe it's 80s or 90s because that's about the time this was published. So I think it was around that time. Could have been a little before then. But you can kind of read and see if you get a sense of when it might have been taking place. But I don't think it ever explicitly says this is 1995 or anything like that. But we do know it's in Japan. The writer's Japanese. And he's, I think he mentioned some places, but not anything too specific that we know what city it's in or anything, I don't think. But at any rate, that story, 80s, 90s Japan, that gives you a good sense of setting. And then again, are there events that have already taken place? When we start the story, I think the narrator kind of mentions meeting this girl for the first time and how that relationship started and then where he is now. But those things are important. The setting, both the events that have taken place already kind of set the stage, but then of course also the place and the time. Just like any story you're reading, language can be either simple or complex or literal or figurative, concrete, or kind of think about those things as you're reading this story, just like all the others that we've done. Just a habit. I'm kind of repeating a lot of this stuff because they're just good kind of reading habits to get into if you don't already do that. And then point of view. Who's telling the story? Is it told from the first person, the narrator, who's basically relaying what happened to him? And another good thing to think about is, do you think you trust the narrator? And there's a thing called reliable or an unreliable narrator. So, and that's sort of a relatively new thing, I guess, or it's something we hadn't thought about until maybe the last 100 years. I know it doesn't sound recent, but if you think about the whole history of literature, it's recent, where you would have a narrator who's actually not being honest, who's maybe just has their own agenda. So is that happening in this story? Do you feel like you trust this person? Are they telling you the whole story? Just good reading questions to ask as you go along through reading this one, or any story that we're reading. And then again, like I said, some universal themes. And I was glad to see in the chat and also in people's essays, some people were bringing up some of the themes that they saw in Edison, New Jersey, especially about social class, materialism, ambition, all these things. It was great. And then I saw some of that as well in the chat. So very good to bring those themes in. It gives us a better, like a nuanced or a richer understanding of everything that's going on in the story. And again, your comments on the discussion board help your classmates as well, because then they also see what other students are thinking. So thanks for that. All right, so question 1 this week for our reading summary. And again, remember the reading summaries are due at the end of the semester, just like our journals. But again, don't wait. It'll for two reasons. One reason it'll help you to write your essay to go ahead and stay up with the readings. But the other reason is, of course, it'll be really hard when you get to May and you're just like, oh my gosh, it's so nice and sunny out and it's May and I want to be outdoors and I have to write 30 journal entries. You don't want to do that at the end of the semester. It'll be much easier if you do a few as you go along. Weekly is ideal. So in this reading, in the second part, we're in the second part of this story for these questions. The girl's boyfriend tells the narrator that he burns down barns. They're kind of a small party at his house. They're smoking pot, they're drinking, they're eating, and I think the girl kind of passes out, and the men are talking, and he says this, he says, "Oh, I happen to burn down barns. I'm kind of an arsonist, right?" And but then the person's like, "Is this for real, or is he just messing with me because just to say something to shock me or scare me or intimidate me, or is he just seeing if I'm dumb, or is it a metaphor? In other words, is he doing something else?" So anyway, these are questions you might want to think about when you get to this part. Is he telling the truth? Why or why not? Why do you think so? So does he actually go out and find these old dilapidated buildings and just burn them down, or not? Or is this some and if not, why would he tell the guy that? So it's a big central kind of question in the story. Again, it's one of these stories where a lot like Hills Like White Elephants, though it's a little longer story, it seems like maybe nothing is happening, but below the surface, I think there's something very sinister maybe even happening here. And that brings up some of our other questions that we'll talk about with the reading summaries and the journals when we get into the essay based on this a little bit later too. So question number 2 in the summary this week. The narrator suspects the girl's boyfriend is committing arson, right? He mentioned that, burning down barns. And the narrator thinks the girl has disappeared at the end of the story. When we get to the end, he can't seem to find her. And he doesn't think she would have just gone away without saying anything. He even visits her apartment, I think, and everything. Yet he doesn't do anything. This is our narrator. Do you think he's too passive? Should he take some action? Why or why not? So that's a question to think about. A lot of people read this story, and one of the themes I might ask you to think about is, how much responsibility do we have for friends or others that we might, just pass in our daily lives? It's just a kind of a question I think this story brings up. Some people would say not much. Some people would say a lot. We're human beings, we have responsibility for each other. Others would say, well, if they're really close to me, but if it's like an acquaintance, maybe not. So think about that for question number 2. Again, this is from the film Burning from 2018, not the short story, but it's very parallel, very similar stuff. And then that story as well, you kind of have the film when you're watching the movie. Why is he not doing more? Well, in the movie, it changes quite a bit. Not to spoil it if you do watch it, but he actually does take some action. He's a lot less passive in the movie than he is in the short story, as far as we know. Now, we don't know the end of this. We just know where the writer stops writing, but maybe something happens after that we can imagine. Kind of like Jhumpa Lahiri's story, where we could imagine, do they stay together or do they split up after the lights come back on, so with their power outages. So again, question number 2 is, do you think the narrator is too passive in this story? Should he take some action? Why or why not? And then finally, the last one for our summary. When the narrator meets the girl's boyfriend near the end of the story, I think they meet like in a coffee shop or bar, and neither man seems to know where the girl is, or they don't say if he does know. What do you think happened to her? So again, as you get to the end of this story, did she just move to a new address and decide she wanted to start over, and these guys are not very nice, so she doesn't really want to hang out with them anymore, or something else? Could something else have happened? And that might tie back into our image of this burning down barns being like a metaphor for something. But you'll have to see. I'll let you read it. I'm not going to interpret it for you, because really it is ambiguous, or it's not clear at the end, I think, of the story what really happened. So you will have to decide as you read this one. And again, this will be connected to a later essay, so don't be discouraged if you feel like this is not connecting to what we're writing right now. We'll be writing about this a little bit later in the class. Finally, our journal for this week 8 is about addiction. And again, this will connect to another story we're going to read later called Sonny's Blues, which I think may be our last short story that we'll read this semester. And so it'll probably make sense later. But take a look at these questions that have to do with addiction. And there's an article from our database, the Viewpoints database from the library. And You can find that in our course content folder for this week, for week 8, about addiction. This question at the end, I think, is the one that maybe needs a little explanation. In your opinion, is addiction caused by biological or environmental factors? If you're not familiar with that, what that's talking about, take a look at this journal reading for this week, addiction, because it does talk about what are environmental and what are I mean, obviously biological is your body, right? Like you're born with sort of a predisposition for addiction or something like that, or is it how you grow up? So it's the old debate, nurture, nature. You might have heard that before. So what happens? Why is someone addicted? Is it a combination of those? Is it just they're just born with a gene for that? Or, some combination? Or again, is it the way they grew up? They had an abusive home and that led them to use alcohol or drugs or whatever to cope with feelings they couldn't handle or whatever. So again, take a look at this. And I think this third question is probably the most tricky to answer. But again, it's journal writing. There's no right or wrong answer. Just asking you to share your thoughts on the reading for this week. And I think that is it. So again, we're looking at burning, barn burning, and then again, if you haven't done that, take a look at the discussion board, sorry, for A Temporary Matter. And so we've got a lot of different readings going on, a lot of different characters to think about. One thing you might start to notice through each one of these stories is the idea of how people relate to each other and how they communicate with each other, which is something I'm really interested in. And so hopefully you can keep going with that. And if you have any questions, as always, send me an email or come to my office hours. And otherwise, I hope you have a great week. Remember Pulaski Day. We won't be on campus. If you were planning to be on campus on Monday for anything, college will be closed. So again, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next video or in office hours.